At 29 years old, I never imagined I'd find myself in a situation quite like this. My name is Alex, and I've been living with my parents for the past year. Not because I couldn't afford rent or needed financial help, but because I bought a house in the city, covering every expense for my family. I pay the mortgage, handle all the bills, and cover the grocery costs. My parents, Mike, 57, and Sarah, 54, retired teachers, don't pay for anything. They had lived a peaceful life in the countryside for years, but recently decided they wanted a change of pace, craving the energy and opportunities of city life. They asked me to join them, explaining that the excitement of city life was calling them, and since I was already working as a software engineer, I thought the move made sense. After all, I was in a good place financially, making a solid six-figure income, and the city offered better career prospects. Plus, I felt I owed them for all they'd done for me growing up, so helping them transition to a new life seemed natural. Together, we found a cozy 3-bedroom house in the city. Not a mansion, but comfortable, with a backyard and a large enough living room for us all. Since I was the one funding everything, I claimed the master bedroom, which had a private bathroom and a walk-in closet, a much-needed perk since I work from home about 80% of the time. I also set up the second bedroom as my home office, complete with 2 monitors, a comfy chair, and everything I needed for work. The third bedroom was left as a guest room for family visits. At first, things went smoothly. We all fell into a routine. My parents were thrilled with their new urban surroundings, enjoying their retirement by gardening, watching TV, and doing the usual retiree activities. Meanwhile, I worked from home, paid the bills, and kept the house tidy. My parents' income, apart from their pensions, was quite modest, so I never expected them to contribute financially. It was just a part of family life. I never thought to charge them rent. However, this harmonious arrangement didn't last long. One morning at breakfast, my mom casually mentioned, "Your sister Lisa and her husband Tom are thinking about moving to the city. Lisa's pregnant, and they could really use some support." At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming that if they moved, they'd get a small apartment nearby. Lisa, 31, and Tom, 32, had always been somewhat of a struggling couple. They never seemed to get settled or fully independent, drifting from one problem to another, but I still hadn't expected what came next. A few days later, my mom sat me down, her tone nonchalant but firm. She told me, "We've invited Lisa and Tom to stay with us, just until they get on their feet." I nodded along, thinking they'd be here temporarily. But what I didn't realize was that my parents hadn't asked for my opinion. They had already decided and invited Lisa and Tom to move in. A week later, they arrived with their luggage in tow, and it soon became clear that they saw this move as permanent. The strain began immediately. Not only was I paying for every aspect of the household, the mortgage, utilities, groceries, but now I had 2 extra people to care for. Nobody asked if I was okay with this. And even though I care about my sister, it felt like my role was taken for granted. Lisa, who had a habit of relying on others, quickly made herself at home. Tom, her husband, carried a quiet sense of entitlement that rubbed me the wrong way. At first, the issues were subtle. Lisa began making comments like, "This place is so big. It must be hard for you to keep it clean by yourself." Or, "We'll need more space for the baby's things once it arrives." I brushed off these remarks initially, but then came the breaking point. One evening, after a long day of work, Lisa and Tom approached me with a proposal. They wanted to take over the master bedroom. Lisa explained that they need more space for the baby, and since my room had the walk-in closet and private bathroom, it made sense for them to have it. Stunned, I asked why they couldn't simply use the guest room. Lisa dismissed the idea, saying the guest room didn't have enough storage space. It was absurd. I paid for the entire mortgage, bought all the food, and yet they felt entitled to my bedroom. My refusal didn't sit well with them. Lisa looked at me as if I was being unreasonable, while Tom seemed taken aback that I wasn't automatically yielding to their demands. After I told them they could either make do with the guest room or find somewhere else, I thought the matter was settled. But things only escalated. A few days later, I had to go into the office for a meeting. When I returned home at lunch, I was shocked to find my belongings piled in the hallway. My computer monitor was unplugged and left on the floor, and my clothes were scattered. As I walked into the master bedroom, there was Lisa packing up the rest of my things. She looked at me nonchalantly and said, "Oh, hey, I was just finishing up. Your mom said we could start moving our stuff in here since the baby's coming soon, and we'll need the space." Furious, I couldn't believe the audacity. My mom, who wasn't paying a single penny toward the mortgage, had given them permission to take over my room without consulting me. I was livid. I confronted Lisa, reminding her that I paid for the house and that they were already occupying the guest room. She crossed her arms, giving me an exasperated look as if I were the unreasonable one, and said, "The guest room is too small and there's no closet. We need extra space." At this point, I'd had enough. I told her firmly, "If you need more space, you're welcome to find your own place. I'm not giving up my room." Lisa, undeterred, insisted, "Your mom said it was fine," as if that ended the discussion. Realizing I was getting nowhere, I left the room and grabbed my phone, ready to settle this once and for all. My mother wasn't even home at the time, so I hadn't been able to bring this up with her directly. When I finally got her on the phone, I asked her point blank, "Mom, did you tell Lisa and Tom they could move into my room?" There was a long silence on her end, like she didn't know how to respond. Eventually, she admitted, "Well, I thought it would be the best solution. They need the space, and you already have the office. It's not like you're using the room for much." I felt my temper rising and replied, "Are you serious right now?" My mother tried to calm me down, insisting it wasn't a big deal and reminding me that we're all family. But I wasn't willing to listen. I pay the mortgage. I pay for all the groceries and bills. And you think it's okay for Lisa and Tom to just take over my room? My voice must have been loud enough for Lisa to hear because suddenly she stormed out, looking furious. "I'm not giving them my room," I told my mom. "If they don't move their stuff, they're going to need to find somewhere else to stay." Just then, Tom entered, looking agitated, probably having heard the noise from outside. He walked in and asked, "What's going on?" I explained, "What's going on is that your wife thinks she can just take over my room without even asking me. And I'm telling both of you right now, it's not happening. You can either stay in the guest room or leave." Tom didn't take that well. He started talking about family and how I should be willing to make sacrifices for them, especially with a baby on the way. But I was beyond reason at that point. Sacrifices? I'm already paying for this entire house. What are you guys contributing? Nothing. And now you think you can just walk in and take over. By this point, our argument had become loud and heated. I turned away, ignoring my mom's attempts to calm me down. Tom kept pressing, saying how unfair I was being, and insisting that family should stick together in hard times. Lisa slammed the door on her way out, while Tom just stood there, glaring at me like I was in the wrong. I had reached my limit. "You've got until the end of the day to move your stuff out of my room. If you don't, I'll move it out myself." With that, I left the room, determined to keep my boundaries intact. I stayed in my office for the rest of the day, trying to calm down. I wasn't going to let them walk all over me in my own house, especially when I was the one footing all the bills. I didn't want to deal with anyone, and I knew my mom would probably get involved again, but I was done backing down. After that blow-up, I hoped maybe Lisa and Tom would finally get the message and back off. My boundaries couldn't have been clearer. They could either stay in the guest room or find another place to live. I thought it was pretty straightforward. The next day, I kept to myself. I wasn't interested in stirring up more drama, and I was still stewing over everything that had happened. I spent most of the day in my office, trying to go about my routine, though I could feel the tension in the house. By the time dinner rolled around, the silence between everyone was almost palpable. No one was talking, and it felt like everyone was avoiding each other, trying not to confront the elephant in the room. I could have tolerated Lisa and Tom staying in the guest room, as long as they stopped causing issues. But that evening, something happened that pushed me over the edge. I went to the kitchen to get some dinner, only to find the refrigerator nearly empty. All the groceries I bought just 2 days ago were gone. I checked the freezer, hoping maybe some of the food was still there, but it was the same story. I knew my parents didn't eat like that, and I certainly hadn't touched the food. It didn't take much to figure out who the culprits were. Lisa and Tom. I was already irritated, but I tried to let it go, thinking I could just buy more groceries tomorrow. But it wasn't just the food. My mother came into the kitchen, avoiding eye contact with me. When I sat down at the table, she served plates to Tom, Lisa, my dad, and herself. Everyone except me. At first, I thought maybe she'd simply forgotten, so I waited, assuming she'd realize. But she sat down and started eating, as though it was perfectly normal. My patience was wearing thin. I turned to my mom and asked, "You didn't make me a plate?" Without looking at me, she said, "You don't want to help the family. You don't eat with the family." I was stunned. Excuse me? I pay for everything here. The groceries, the mortgage, and now I'm being shut out. My dad just sighed and kept eating, ignoring what was happening. Meanwhile, Lisa and Tom sat there with smug looks on their faces, like they'd somehow won a victory. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt my anger boil over. I slammed the refrigerator door shut and stormed out of the kitchen, knowing what I had to do. I went straight to my room, grabbed my laptop, and started looking up eviction notices. If they wanted to treat me like an outsider in my own house, then they could find somewhere else to live. Within an hour, I had the paperwork printed and ready. I made 2 copies, one for my parents and one for Lisa and Tom. Enough was enough. For weeks, they'd been disrespecting me, acting like they owned the place, and now they were freezing me out because I wouldn't cave to their ridiculous demands. I walked into the living room, where everyone was sitting as if nothing was wrong. I didn't say a word as I handed over the eviction notices. Tom's face went pale. He stammered, "You can't be serious." "I am serious," I replied. "If you're not out by tomorrow, I'm calling the police." Tom got to his feet, clearly upset, but I didn't back down. "I'm done with this. You've been freeloading here, without contributing anything. Now you think you can take over my house? Not anymore." He tried to argue, but I stood my ground. I was taller than him, and I wasn't about to be intimidated by his temper tantrum. This was my home, and I wasn't going to be treated like a doormat anymore. "We're leaving, Emily," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You can't just throw us out." "Yes, I can," I responded firmly, stepping closer to him. "I'm the one who pays for this house. Not you, not Lisa, and not Mom or Dad. If you can't be respectful, you don't get to stay here." Lisa, of course, began to cry, as if that would change anything. "I'm pregnant, and you're kicking us out? What kind of brother are you?" "I'm the kind of brother who's been paying for everything while the 2 of you take advantage of me," I shot back. Tom looked like he wanted to argue further, but I could see realization beginning to dawn in his expression. "You have 24 hours, I said. "That's more than generous." Just then my mother, who had been sitting silently all day, finally spoke up. "You can't do this, honey," she pleaded. "They're your sister and brother-in-law. This is family." I pointed to the eviction notice I'd prepared earlier. "It's already done," I replied coldly. "You have 30 days to find somewhere else. If you're not gone by then, I'll take legal action." The room went silent after that, my father staring at the table as though he didn't know how to respond. My mother seemed on the verge of tears, but I didn't let myself feel guilty. This wasn't about kindness anymore. It was about boundaries and respect. After a few long, tense minutes, I walked back to my room, leaving them all to process everything I had said. Closing the door behind me, I let out a long breath, realizing how intense the confrontation had been. I'd never thought I'd have to kick out my own family, but in that moment, it felt right. I refused to let them walk all over me any longer. The house was eerily quiet for the rest of the evening. No one tried to challenge me or knock on my door. I suppose they all realized that I was serious this time. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. If they couldn't respect me, they didn't deserve to live here. The next morning, I woke up and lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. Today was the deadline. Lisa and Tom had 24 hours to leave. I didn't feel angry anymore. I had accepted that this was the only way forward. Now, it was all about carrying it out. As I walked into the kitchen, I noticed that the house felt different, not exactly tense but quieter, more serene. It was like the calm before something big was about to happen. I decided to make myself breakfast, and as I rummaged through the mostly empty fridge, thanks to Lisa and Tom's last grocery raid, I pieced together a simple meal. Sitting down to eat, I reflected on how quickly things had changed. Not long ago, my parents and I were getting along fine, and I was covering the mortgage and groceries without a problem. Then Lisa and Tom arrived, and everything spiraled out of control. A couple of hours later, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway. It's incredible how quickly people can start feeling entitled to things they didn't earn. My dad walked in quietly, picked up a cup of coffee, and sat down across from me at the table. He didn't say anything at first, just stared out the window while sipping his coffee. Eventually, he broke the silence. "Lisa and Tom are leaving today," he said quietly. I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure if he was reminding me of the deadline or informing me of their decision. Either way, I nodded and continued eating. "They don't have anywhere to go," he added in a low voice. I paused mid-bite and looked up at him. He went on, "They're going to stay at a motel for a while until they figure things out." A part of me felt bad, but I reminded myself that I had given them time and had been more than fair. I had been kind for too long, and if I didn't set boundaries now, they would just continue taking advantage of me. I kept my tone calm as I replied, and to my surprise, he didn't try to guilt-trip me. He simply nodded, accepting my decision, and sipped his coffee. I think he finally understood that I wasn't going to back down this time. There was no going back to the way things were. Around midday, Lisa and Tom started packing. Not wanting to provoke another argument or deal with any passive-aggressive comments, I stayed in my room most of the time. I could hear them moving about, loading their things into bags and boxes, the sound punctuated by the occasional muffled conversation. The house felt like it was shedding a layer of tension, slowly returning to the calm I had missed for so long. By the end of the day, they were gone. Tom knocked on my door, his voice growing louder as he walked down the hallway. I could tell something was about to escalate. "You're really going to let this happen?" he shouted, his tone sharp as he stood there, clearly upset. He was still angry about the eviction notice I'd given him. "You're just going to kick us out like this?" he asked, disbelief mixing with resentment in his eyes. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I gave you 24 hours, Tom. I told you what needed to happen." He shook his head, his teeth clenched, and his face tense with frustration. "We're family. You don't do this to family." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Family doesn't take advantage of each other," I replied, my voice steady. "I'm not kicking you out for no reason. You've been freeloading here for weeks. I've been paying the mortgage, the groceries, everything, instead of being grateful. You tried to take my room and push me out of my own house." Tom stood silent for a moment, his face a mix of anger and guilt. He knew I was right, but didn't want to admit it. "So that's it, huh? You're just throwing us out?" he muttered, defeated. "You can find somewhere else to live, or you can stay in the guest room and actually respect my space," I said firmly. "If you can't do that, then, yes, you're leaving." Tom stared at me, his expression hard to read, then turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door and let out a long breath. As much as I knew it had to be done, it still felt draining. By the afternoon, Tom and his girlfriend, Lisa, were gone. They packed up their belongings, loaded the car, and left without saying anything to me. The house felt different as they drove away, quieter, less tense. I hadn't expected any kind of heartfelt farewell, but I couldn't ignore the strange mix of relief and emptiness I felt. My parents didn't say much that day. They were still processing everything that had happened. My mother, especially, seemed to have mixed feelings. Although she hadn't spoken much about it, I could tell she was beginning to see things from my perspective, that maybe I wasn't the one at fault here. Later that evening, my mom knocked on my door. Lisa and Tom had pushed me to my limit, and I think she realized it now. She entered my room, sitting on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor for a while before finally speaking. "They're gone," she murmured, almost to herself. I nodded, staying silent. She looked up at me, her face a mix of regret and understanding. I never thought it would come to this. I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand the pressure I'd been under. "It's not that I didn't want to help," I said softly, "but it felt like you and Dad didn't consider my needs at all. Like my space and my feelings didn't matter." She sighed, nodding slowly. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of unspoken words filling the room. "You're right," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "We should have seen it sooner." I broke the quiet. "I don't want you and Dad to leave," I admitted, the tension in my voice giving way to honesty. "But if things don't change, I can't keep living like this." She looked agitated but understanding. She stood up slowly, as if the weight of everything was finally catching up to her. "We'll sort it out," she promised. "Things will be different." A strange mix of relief and exhaustion settled over me as she left the room. While the immediate issue with Lisa and Tom was resolved, I knew there was still work to do with my parents. But for the first time, it felt like they were willing to listen, like they understood that I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace for everyone else's comfort. As the house settled into silence, the tension that had hovered for weeks finally lifted. I had my space back. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was something, a step toward respecting my own boundaries. Looking back, I realize how important it is to stand up for yourself, even if it means going against family expectations. Sometimes, setting boundaries isn't about selfishness. It's about protecting your well-being. I had finally taken control of my life, spoken my truth, and demanded the respect I deserved. It hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. That night, as I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of strength and self-respect I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew whatever challenges came next, I'd be ready to face them head-on with a new sense of resilience.